Washington, D.C. has recently witnessed intense and violent protests against President Trump, fueled by opposition to his policies, notably his rhetoric on Palestine and the deployment of the National Guard in the city. These protests, led by civil rights and human rights groups, reflect a larger crisis of political polarization and social division gripping the United States. The assassination of Charlie Kirk, a pro-Trump activist murdered in broad daylight during a heated university debate, starkly illustrates the rise of political violence and the erosion of common ground between adversaries. As Trump's popularity declines in historic lows, the future of American democracy, its institutions, stabilities, and values is increasingly uncertain. Can a democracy survive amidst such deep societal divisions and violent confrontations? How will these tensions shape the future of governance and social cohesion in the United States? I'm Henny Saif, and this is Think Tank.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
Conservative activist Charlie Kirk was fatally shot during an event at Utah Valley University, a tragedy deeply mourned by President Donald Trump. According to Time magazine, Trump described Kirk as a patriot and martyr for truth and freedom, emphasizing his profound impact on engaging young Americans in political debate. The president condemned the culture of demonizing political opponents, attributing such rhetoric to escalating political violence, and vowed to hold accountable those responsible for this and other acts of violence. Trump ordered U.S. flags to fly at half-mast until Sunday and called for unity around values like free speech, rule of law, and patriotic devotion. Kirk's death is seen as a dark moment for America, but Trump asserted that Kirk's voice and legacy will continue to resonate.
In Washington, the roar of protest has become a constant backdrop. What began as opposition to Donald Trump now symbolizes something far deeper. Fractures running through the heart of American society and governance. Crowds surged through the Capitol, outraged by his policies, especially his hardline stance on Palestine and the decision to deploy the National Guard against demonstrators.
Counting or not counting gang violence? Great.
The assassination of Charlie Kirk during a campus debate stunned the nation, a grim reminder that political conflict is no longer confined to words or rallies, but can erupt into deadly confrontation. The nation feels split down the middle. Trump's supporters argue he is restoring order. His critics see authoritarianism tightening its grip. Civil and human rights groups have stepped to the forefront, demanding accountability and warning that his rhetoric of restoring order by force carries dangerous implications. At the same time, Trump's political standing is weakening. Polls place his approval between 37% and 42%, with independents, once vital to his victories, now dropping to a historic low of 29%. Economic frustration, accusations of authoritarian governance, and divisive domestic policies all fuel the discontent. The polarization is no longer just partisan. It cuts across communities and institutions, eroding democratic norms. Experts caution that his fragility endangers the stability of America's institutions, even as civil society pushes back to defend them. Abroad, Trump's hardline policies on Palestine invite criticism and diminish U.S. diplomatic influence, while at home, unrest deepens. The question now is stark. Can American democracy withstand the storm, or is it beginning to unravel?
To better understand what this moment means for American democracy, we're joined by Ms. Ginger Chapman, the Washington-based lawyer and political analyst, and Mr. Peter Roth, the contributing editor at Newsweek. Together, they will help us unpack the violent protests, Trump's weakening popularity, and the broader implications for America's political future. Welcome to Think Tank. I'll start off with Mr. Roth. First off, how do experts characterize the killing of Charlie Kirk in the context of the recent surge in U.S. political violence?
It's good to be with you, but I have to challenge your premise. There hasn't been a surge in political violence. Political violence has always been part of the American system, not a big part, and certainly it's much less important, much less prominent than one would suspect in a nation of 300 million people where there are more guns per capita than any other nation on earth. But there's always been political violence. It waxes. Now there are demonstrations against Trump paid for by left-wing billionaires, and it's easy to get people out if you pay them. There were demonstrations against Bush. There were demonstrations against Reagan. There were demonstrations against Nixon. When in my 20s, I marched. I marched for Reagan values, and I marched for Reagan issues. But public protest, public dissent is part of the American system. And I don't think that it's ever quite been as strong, frankly. The idea that we are having such a vigorous debate and that so many people have a voice now is incredible. And the fact that things remain structured within the system. And yes, we are testing consistently the constitutional checks and balances that were gifted us by the founders to protect our individual liberty and our right to free speech and conscience. The fact that those checks and balances are being vigorously tested is a good thing. The problem we have now, and it's a specific problem, is that there is a fringe element, or there was a fringe element in one of the political parties that now runs that political party, where the dominant ethos is they're not for the protection of free speech, they're for the protection of their speech. Mm-hmm. And what happened in Utah yesterday is, I think, an extreme example of that view in practice. But the suppression of speech on college campuses goes on every day. And that's the kind of thing that Charlie Kirk devoted much of his adult life to challenging.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Chapman, what's your take on the normalization of the political violence that is, as Mr. Roth mentioned, part and parcel of the U.S. political life? I mean, we're talking now about Charlie Kirk, but we've seen the assassination attempt on Donald Trump earlier, Reagan, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, all the way back to Lincoln.
Yes, well, first, Mr. Haney, thank you for having us today, and greetings to your viewers and to your other guest, Mr. Roth. And I respectfully disagree with Mr. Roth. We are entering a new period of political violence, civil terrorism, and civil unrest. In fact, Charlie Kirk himself predicted months ago that he could be the target of assassination. And he also pointed out that in America, we are entering a new period of assassination culture. And as you noted, not just the 2 assassination attempts on President Trump's life, the 2 that we know about, but we are seeing a shift from the 1960s, 70s era protests where people would march peacefully. Yes, there was always an element of violence and wrong, but we're entering a new era where this is a systematic escalation of civil violence. As Mr. Roth pointed out, many of these protesters are paid. However, many of them are driven by extreme radical ideology. These are the groups like Antifa, which we see on the west coast of the United States. For example, Oregon, they've had them in a state of constant political rioting and protest. We see whenever there are Republicans in power, the Democrats escalate the violence as a way to create chaos and disorder to undermine any Republican leadership. And we're at the point where ideology now trumps loyalty to America. And the assassination of Charlie Kirk is just one more indication that America is entering a period of profound violence, which the last time we saw anything like this predated the Civil War, where President Abraham Lincoln suspended posse comitatus. We had military in the streets. We see this happening again. President Trump is trying to restore law and order, but we wind up with military on the streets in Los Angeles, in DC, perhaps in Baltimore and Chicago. We also see an era of might makes right on the part of our administration. This is exemplified by our strike on the small boat off the coast of Venezuela. It's still unclear who was on that boat, but we are seeing a pattern of escalating violence from the Democrats, from radical groups like Antifa, from paid protesters. At the same time, we are seeing the voting populace call for a crackdown on law and order. We see Trump trying to restore law and order. He perceives this as a criminal problem. However, the criminal problem is becoming tied in with the political violence. The truth is, during the COVID years, we had a rapid increase in violence in this country. It was masked because the Biden administration had the FBI change their reporting of crime. So many major cities, LA, New York, Chicago, Baltimore, they were left out of Biden's crime statistics. So our criminal violence is off the charts. It's much greater than what's being reported through the FBI. And now we are seeing this escalation of political violence. We are only 7-8 months into the Trump administration. But if it's anything like his first administration, we will see Democrats, left-wingers, progressives mobilize their troops, promise them bail if they're arrested. So we are seeing an escalation of political violence in this country. The new term is civil terrorism, and this is what we're seeing, and it's more complicated by the protests over our foreign policies. So
Yes.
we're entering a very dangerous time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Roth, what do you think are the main ideologies or the main motivation for the political violence or civil terrorism that has been observed in the U.S. since the early 2025? I mean, we're talking about protests against deportations, what's happening in Palestine, and how does Kirk's death fit into them, especially that he was actually shot during, while answering a question regarding the Second Amendment, which has been a major debate in the U.S. Administration across the years?
Well, first of all, let me say, while I appreciate Ms. Chapman's respectful disagreement, it's not necessary. Disagree with me disrespectfully if you want. I'm a big boy. I can take it. Words don't hurt. And you know what? I will defend to my death your right to say it, because we live in a free speech country with a free speech culture. And there are people, particularly administrators on college campuses and professors, who refuse to recognize that. So it gets bottled up. Again, I don't see things getting worse. I see things getting better. We are confronting problems that ought to have been confronted a long time ago, but we made excuses for it. And the dominant culture the people that establish what the national narrative is supposed to be, of which I am not part, talked about safe spaces and triggering and understanding because, again, they don't believe in free speech, they believe in their speech. And that's the principal problem. If you want to talk about crime, crime is an exemplar of the divide in this country, which is now not a divide between red states and blue states, but it's red states and blue cities. And look at who runs the blue cities. And they can't handle the crime problem. They won't prosecute criminals. District attorneys like the one in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, who spent all of his time going after Donald Trump and none of his time going after muggers and rapists and murderers and drug dealers. There's a hands-off approach to prosecuting crime because we've told a lie that Black people are unfairly prosecuted, disproportionately prosecuted for crimes when white people are not. And the racial sensitivity of that has led to inertia. Crime is not being addressed. That's a big problem, but that's a problem that rests largely on who? The Democrats who control the big cities. This is what the data shows. You can't argue against this. And so Donald Trump going to the extraordinary lengths to use the National Guard in places like Washington, D.C., where the crime numbers have dropped dramatically. Now, I'm not in favor of this as a long-term solution, but the crime numbers have dropped dramatically. And what people like former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton and Mayor Rudy Giuliani proved in the 1990s is if you arrest the criminals for small crimes, the big crimes stop. Why? Because the people who commit the small crimes also commit the big crimes. And we've stopped arresting people for the small crimes. And we throw our hands up. In Chicago, every weekend, they have the equivalent of a mass shooting, 30 people dead. And the mayor refuses to do anything about it. So when the president of the United States says, okay, we're going to send in the National Guard to restore order, the mayor and the governor tell the police not to cooperate with the National Guard trying to bring civil order to the streets within the confines of everybody's constitutional protections. Mm-hmm. That's obstruction of justice. But more than that, it's madness. It's madness.
Well, Ms.
The people who are running the Democratic Party today are insane.
Well, Ms. Chapman,
that's what's leading
yes,
to the criminal explosion.
Well, Mr. Roth, I understand that, and Ms. Chapman has a different point of view, and that is also reflected in the reaction to Kirk's death in Congress. How does that reflect on the wider political divisions then?
Yes, well, Mr. Haney, if that question was directed towards me,
yes.
I do agree with Mr. Roth that what we are seeing in our country is madness. And the criminal violence is not just criminal, it is part of a strategy of sowing unrest, chaos, and disorder in this country. I agree it's largely coming from Democratic policies to have no cash bail, so criminals are released onto the sidewalk back into the public. Please note, this is a strategy that Chairman Mao did in his Great Revolution. His Great Leap Forward. He released criminals onto the streets to terrorize professors and to terrorize the everyday population. This is a strategy that Adolf Hitler conducted in Germany. He also released criminals into the streets. This is a tactic to create a sense of fear and low-grade terror among the general population, and that is what's happening in America today. And the criminal violence creeps into the political violence when we look at specific acts. For example, the young man who was white, Mangione, who shot the insurance company healthcare executive on the streets of New York last year in cold blood, walked up behind him, shot him in the head. He had 2 sons. He was also a young father, just like Charlie Kirk. And we also saw the the Democrat, a radical activist who went to the baseball game between Republicans and Democrats and shot a bunch of Republicans, put Stephen Scalise, one of the representatives, in a wheelchair permanently. Senator Rand Paul was attacked and beat up. So we have Democrats using the cover of this constant increasing street violence, criminal violence, as a cover for increasing political violence. And yes, Trump is sending the National Guard out on the streets. This is not a long-term solution. They have different rules of engagement than law enforcement, so they are not equipped to handle violent crime. Once again, the rules of engagement, how they can interact with civilians, whether they can conduct arrests, stops, search and seizures, things that law enforcement can do. And this just shows the chaos that America and our administration is in. And this is because the American people, especially Trump's base, his America First voters, we see that President Trump is putting all of his attention on foreign issues that we want resolved with the foreign issues are a completely different topic. The American people are extremely unhappy there. We would like to see Trump extricate himself from these foreign entanglements, not be dragged deeper into foreign wars, and focus his attention here at home because America is in a disarray. Our violence is off the charts, and Trump needs to fulfill his campaign promises and fix things at home because this increasing violence is becoming untenable. And it won't be like the Civil War where the North lined up against the South. It was very clear, as Mr. Roth pointed out. We have red states with blue cities in them, and we have some blue states with economic powerhouses, red cities in them. So a civil war is not going to be a neat lining up of North against South. Our neighborhoods, our people are intermingled. And so what we are seeing is what we will see is what we see now, unfocused civil terrorism, increasing political violence, and this will come to a head. Many people wonder if we are even going to make it to another presidential election. Our military and economic and analysts say the next few years do not bode well for America's law and order. The midterms are right around the corner. 2026 could get very, very volatile with civil terrorism if we do not address it now.
We'll get to that a little bit later. Now, Mr. Roth, you've mentioned earlier that you know stranger to marches or protests a while ago. So using your experience, how do the protests and polarization impact the U.S. governance at the federal and local levels then?
It's a way to vent. It's a way to make a point. I never saw it as anything more than that. When I put on my soft shoes and my jeans and grabbed a sign and went out into the streets, I was making a point. And I was doing it not just to make the point for the people around me, but to make a point for the cameras that I hoped would be there. And that's what some of these political protests are about. They're about intimidation. But, you know, I can't begin to dissect what Ms. Chapman just had to say for the errors of fact that she made, starting with the fact that Steve Scalise isn't in a wheelchair. He uses crutches sometimes, but he's not in a wheelchair. He was shot. He almost died, but he's not in a wheelchair. And now he's the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives and is a cheerful, happy warrior. The upcoming elections are not threatened. The next national election is not threatened. The democratic process is intact. It would be better off if we took more seriously the problems of voter fraud, the problems of people who manipulate the process to get votes into the system that don't belong there. But the democratic process is strong and will continue to be strong. Been strong through every national crisis. We never missed a national election because of a national emergency. We had elections during World War I. We had elections during World War II. We had an election in 1864 in the middle of the Civil War. Lincoln, as most everybody knows, won. But all of that is different from what happened yesterday to Charlie Kirk, which, as the evidence unfolds, is clearly a targeted political assassination. Mm-hmm. And there are people who believe that's okay, and there are people who believe it's not okay. And you know what? The preponderance of the people who seem to believe it's okay and who have carried these things out all line up on the left. Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist who thought he'd be welcomed as a hero in Cuba for killing John Kennedy. The two people that tried to assassinate Gerald Ford were both of the left. John Hinckley was trying to impress Jodie Foster and was a seriously sociologically ill person. But the guy who shot up the baseball field and almost killed Congressman Scalise was a Bernie Sanders supporter from who had traveled to Washington for this specific purpose. The motivations of the guy who shot at Donald Trump and hit him in Butler, Pennsylvania, have been obscured and uninvestigated, but the guy who was set up to shoot at him at the golf course in Florida, his motivation is a lot more clear. There are people who believe in political violence, and where the right has fallen down in defending itself is, over the years, we have been willing to acknowledge, or we have been quick to acknowledge, that these are acts of madness that don't have political motivation, and that we shouldn't blame the entire progressive movement for what crazy people do. But you know what? When crazy people on the right do things like they shoot an abortion doctor, every conservative gets blamed. Every conservative gets asked about it. Every conservative is expected to have an opinion. And if they not only don't condemn the shooter, but the pro-life cause that the shooter believed they were intending, they're bad people. Mm-hmm. There's an imbalance, and it's an imbalance that is magnified by the people who are supposed to be neutral, like me, and explain to the American people what's going on so they can make up their own minds. And that's why I think, in part, our democracy is so safe right now, because of the proliferation of ways that now exist for people to communicate their ideas. I'm talking to people right now halfway across the world who have an interest in American politics from the den in my house. That wasn't possible 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but I can do that now.
Yes. Well,
and that's why our society is so strong and robust.
What do you think about that, Ms. Chapman? Is the American democracy safe? Do you believe American democracy is in danger, or can it emerge stronger from this situation? What are the prospective impacts of these protests then on upcoming elections, as you've mentioned?
Well, first, Steve Scalise was in a wheelchair after he was shot. I'm happy that now he is able to use crutches. And the implications for the long-term prospects of America, one thing Mr. Roth overlooks is that in the past, both parties had a vested interest in keeping the United States unified, the United States of America. Now we see that there are groups whose interest is not in keeping America unified. They wish to attain power for themselves. They do not care about the long-term well-being of this country. We see financial groups that are engaging in asset flight, and the long-term prospects for this country, we do have groups that want to disrupt our normal political order. We have groups that say if they cannot be in power, they will just as soon burn the country down to rule over the ashes. And our economists are saying that we are on very shaky financial ground right now. As economic pressures get worse, that will deepen the social divisions and the divisions between the red states and the blue states. And once again, our midterms coming up in 2026 is going to be where a lot of this plays out. President Trump's record, both domestically and foreign, will be on trial at the midterms, and this will all be against a backdrop of increasing political violence to get their way. We see groups, a great example is the controversy over the transgenders. In fact, yesterday when Charlie Kirk was shot, there was another school shooting on the same day. 3 people were shot yesterday in a school. And this did not make the news because of the high-profile nature and the long-term political implications of Charlie Kirk. So what we are seeing is a backdrop of increasing violence. I do not blame the guns. This violence takes many forms, using many objects. So this is just a generalized, chronic, increasing violence. I do believe if more people were armed in this country, we would see a lot less violence. Our Second Amendment is the only thing keeping us away from total anarchy. But this will increase.
Yes, and that was the last debate Charlie Kirk had before he was shot. Ms. Ginger Chapman and Mr. Peter Roth, thank you very much for your insights and analysis. As this episode closes, Charlie Kirk's tragic death underlines the urgent need to confront political violence and deepen democratic respect. It challenges Americans to reject division and uphold free expression. Only through unity and renewed commitment to democratic values can the nation hope to heal and secure its future. And the details and whereabouts of the assassin of Charlie Kirk is still not disclosed, is still undisclosed, and we will be following up the latest developments here on Q News. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode of Think Tank. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for joining us.